The world has been privileged to see so many breakthroughs and even experience the wonderful exploitation of science and how it has helped humanity even up until now. As far as inventions are concerned, we have enjoyed a vast amount of initiatives and products of the power of human brain. We can see these technological advances everywhere we go. And one of the most clearly distinguished advancements in this world today is the space shuttle systems. On January 28, 1986, the space shuttle called Space Shuttle Challenger launched into the skies. And before I delve deeper, let me give you a background of this space shuttle program. You may have known that the orbiter vehicle 099 was the second operational orbiter of NASA's reusable space shuttle fleet. You don't need to really gulp down all of this information. Basically, the Space Shuttle Challenger was first launched in 1983. It flew 9 successful missions, but after the 9th mission, trying to fly the 10th mission, something happened. And it actually resulted in the death of 7 crew members, which brought a profound reshaping of NASA's human spaceflight program. What really happened? On the day, that is 20th January, millions watched as the Space Shuttle Challenger launched into the skies. But behind the scenes, something was wrong. Engineers had warned about a critical flaw. What many technologians know as the zero-ring seals, which basically were supposed to be part of the booster system of the space shuttle, could fail under low temperatures, and engineers carefully warned the developers. The night before the launch was unusually cold, as we are told during the time in Miami, Florida. But unfortunately, the developers did not listen. The risk was real, but the leadership pressed forward. Confidence overruled caution, and ambition overruled warning. 73 seconds after the launch, the shuttle exploded, and you can tell what happened after that. In fact, on the freezing morning at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Challenger lifted off with hope, but ended up being exploded into debris. Pause and listen to this. Do you know that there are several decisions that man has made and out of pride has resulted in man's demise? When you look at this particular story, which is actually real, you would understand that investigations later revealed a painful truth. It wasn't just a technical failure, it was a failure of humility. And this is because decision makers believed they knew enough. They ignored voices that challenged them. Let me ask you, how often does pride blind us to reality? How often do we assume we are right, even when evidence says otherwise? And as we delve deeper, you would understand that this is not just a leadership problem, it is a human problem. Let's take it from a different angle. We are told that whosoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Our episode today discusses what pride really is, even as evidenced in the scientific world. It appears that many people have things they value a lot. And when I want to ask you, what is valuable about you? I believe it could be a challenging question. But the most important thing that many people tend not to really look at is what they acknowledge to be valuable to them. Now, let me put it this way. If I say a lot, which many would see as a proud position, I acknowledge that everything I am and I have been achieved by myself, technically. But what if I say a lot because God considers me as his son? Is that pride? Another opinion. If I say nothing, which many people think should be a humble position, I also acknowledge that everything I am and have comes from God. But what if I say nothing because I lack self-esteem? What if I say nothing? Yes, because I lack self-esteem. Well, this is quite a challenging situation because pride could be misdefined and could be misconstrued to be pride where it's not. Maybe we need to visit some examples. And through this discourse, we will look at Lucifer. Well, you would want to treat it as biblical, and I'm very much interested in that as well. How he showed pride. What about the disciples of Christ? Then, on the other side of the coin, what is real humility? The tax collector, Moses, and Jesus. Let's begin. There are several examples of pride as depicted in the good book, but none surpasses the originator of pride. In 1 John 2:16 we are told, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." And when you speak about this, you tend to really understand that it is important to speak of whom this feeling first arose. Before humanity ever struggled with pride, it began with a being of perfection. Isaiah perfectly specified this, that Lucifer declared he will ascend, he will exalt, he will be like the Most High. In fact, when I'm directly referencing this, Lucifer said, "I will ascend, I will exalt, and I will be like the Most High." The use of "I" is very much clearly seen in these passages. And it appears we have inherited, in a way, the desire to do whatever pleases us as a people. Unfortunately, we crave to gain positions that allow us to acquire fame or wealth, which in itself is never bad, because that is what the world offers. But listen to this. Do you know that in psychology, excessive self-focus is linked to distorted perception, and it is linked to the loss of empathy? In other words, the more you magnify yourself, the more you minimize what is real. The more the self is magnified, the more reality is minimized. And Lucifer's problem in this case was not lack of position, it was actually discontent with the position that he had. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy to know that not all aspiration is pride. In fact, when a child is successful, when personally you have an ambition, it is not merely unhealthy pride, but it is noteworthy to remember that our possessions, skills, and achievements never determine our worth. And that is why pride consists of not giving God the glory for what He has done in your life. This happens to be the human condition, unfortunately. Well, let's move on. What we are told of the disciples of Christ is also profound. And that is something that we cannot overlook. In today's world, success is measured by visibility, worth is measured by wealth, and influence is measured by followers. And that is why it appears it is almost certain that to have a lot of recognition, you should have a lot of followers. Consider the social media. But here is the paradox. The more we chase significance, the more insecure we often become. And you can really ascertain this when you look at the lives of celebrities around. Though they are famous, many still feel insecure and are almost always never fully satisfied. Well, what does the disciples have for us? Biblically, these wonderful people had the privilege to spend more than 3 years with Christ. And He had just washed their feet and told them about His blood shed for them. But unfortunately, their conversation during the dinner time had nothing to do with all of this. It was basically a question: which of them was the greatest? Wow, after all this, they were still led by pride to believe they deserved the top spot. And the gravity of their feelings was so grave that they never felt how it was preventing them from realizing the weightier matters. They were pushing God away from their hearts because of their pride. The question was, who is the greatest? But before I continue, let me give you a gist of what behavioral science has to tell us. Exposure does not equal change. And note this carefully. You can be around greatness. You can hear truth repetitively. You can witness powerful experiences and still remain unchanged internally. And that is proven by behavioral science. The disciples had seen miracles, they had heard teachings, they had experienced Jesus, yet pride still lingered. And that is when Christ got straight to the point. I am among you as the one who serves. In other words, if you want to be great like your master, serve others. Basically, external proximity, as the disciples had enjoyed, did not guarantee internal transformation. Wow, this tells us that pride is subtle. It can exist in achievement, religion, and even morality. In other words, pride is not always loud. Sometimes it is actually quite self-sufficiency. Well, enough of pride. What about the good ways? Humility. One of the most popular, if not the most recounted, is the tax collector's experience according to Luke chapter 18. In the Gospel of Luke 18 verse 13, a man simply prays, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." But there's a Pharisee who talks about himself to God. In fact, describes his good works and how he values the merits he has been given before heaven. The Pharisee lists his achievements, whereas the tax collector is actually asking God for help. Now, don't be quick to judge. The Pharisee indeed probably may have had the good deeds that he was professing. But before someone who is omniscient, it was not necessary, especially in the fact that the strength to have done those did not come from him. But the tax collector in this case, in fact, considering their moral and even their worthiness, you might have always concluded that the tax collector should be rich. In the sight of God, probably, as far as wealth is concerned, he was better than the Pharisee. But it is so wonderful to know. The paradox is that the rich tax collector is actually asking God for help because he sees himself as a sinner. By humbly presenting himself before God, he went down to his house justified, as Christ would say. And this reminds me about a very important principle in sociology. In fact, studies in social psychology show that people consistently overestimate their goodness and they underestimate their flaws. Many people would want to look at what they are good at than what they are not good at. So basically, pride blinds us to ourselves. But when we allow true humility, when we acknowledge our sin and ask Christ's help, then we will not look upon others as inferior, because we find ourselves there as well. We will not seek public recognition because it actually brings us nothing aside more attention. We would let others give us the recognition. We will receive the grace of God and finally will impart that grace to others. What about Moses? In fact, his whole life presents to us a process of humility, because Moses was trained to be the next Pharaoh. He had undergone the various technological advancement trainings we may want to see today. He began as educated, powerful, and positioned for greatness. At 40 actually, he thought he could deliver Israel. Well, he failed. Because pride and education was not simply the best way out. After 40 years in the wilderness, another 40 years of communion with God made him a very humble man. In leadership studies, isolation and failure often produces reflection, recalibration, and growth. In this case, Moses lost his status, his confidence, and eventually his self-reliance. He gained full dependence on God. He could be used by God to send plagues, cross the sea, receive the 10 Commandments, and even speak directly with Him. The example of Moses shows us that humility does not arise spontaneously in us. It is a system. It is something that develops over time and requires patience. Moses was very humble. While pride says I can, humility says God can through me. Well, can we end without looking at Christ? The perfect example. We know that it is very important how Christ had to undergo a transformation of power. Consider this. How great Christ was, how powerful He was, and even His kingship. Yet He renounced everything out of love for us. And even though faced with such humiliation, everything we have, everything we are, or everything we could ever become pales in strict comparison. In human systems, power elevates, authority dominates, but in Christ, power serves and greatness stoops. Inasmuch as it was unpleasant in His days Christ redefined greatness, that I am among you as the one who serves. This is not weakness. It is a controlled strength. Wow. Philippians 2:5 tells us, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus. And we are to do nothing through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let us esteem one another. Wow. What a privilege it is for us. The very thing we need most, which is grace, is blocked by the very thing we often carry, which is pride. Humility is not optional. It is essential for reality. And that reminds me again of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It did not explode because of ignorance. It exploded because warnings were ignored. Lucifer did not fall because he lacked knowledge. He fell because he rejected truth. And the disciples did not struggle because they lacked proximity. They struggled because of pride. So in a nutshell, the greatest danger is not ignorance. It is thinking we already know enough. And I believe you can understand this from your own life and perspective. What is making you proud? And if you are not proud as you think, maybe it's time to consider again.